Tonight, I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak, and thank my pastors for that, honor them for everything that they're doing. And tonight, with the Lord's help, I want to talk about this thought, when I stopped running. When I stopped running. Now, when it comes to running, I'm not a runner. I don't enjoy running. There are people that can go out and just run, and they enjoy it. It makes them happy. I'm not one of those people. But there are several different things that could cause somebody to run. And you could either make somebody run away from something, or you can make somebody run towards something. And I know a few people in this room well enough to know what would cause them to run away. For example, if I took a little mouse and I got within 20 feet of Amanda Shoup, I know she's going to take off running, and she's going to keep running because I've seen it happen. I know that if a bat swoops down from the ceiling in the middle of the service, I know that Pastor Wayne is going to take off running and jump out one of those windows. There are things that will get people running. And the funny thing is that if you think about it, a little mouse isn't going to do anything to you. A mouse, at no point in your life have you ever been assaulted by a mouse. They have never bit you, right? But it's so funny how we respond to things like that. So there are other things, deeper things that could cause people to run. For example, if you've been hurt in your life, maybe you've gone through a bad relationship and there's been some emotional damage that's been done to you. When you enter into another relationship, when you start getting close to somebody, you could be afraid of getting hurt again, and it could cause you to run. That makes a little more sense, right? There are also things like maybe you disagree, maybe you don't like what's going on around you. You might run from a situation or a place. And then there are things that might cause you to run towards them. Maybe it's something that you're tempted with. Maybe it's a desire that you have, a dream that you have. It's something that you are running towards. Now, if I let loose a mouse, not many people are going to run towards the mouse. But if I dropped a $100 bill, there would be all kinds of people that would do everything they could to run and get that $100 because it's something they want. Now, I want to talk to you tonight, now that we've laid the groundwork, I want to talk to you tonight about Jonah, because Jonah is a man that is famous for running. In every Sunday school class, every child knows about Jonah. There's VeggieTale movies about him. I remember being in Sunday school class and they had the little whiteboard with all the stickers that stuck to him. Jonah is one of the main stories that they taught us about. So growing up, I knew Jonah was somebody that ran from God, got swallowed by a whale, spit up, all these different things. So if you want to join me, we're going to start in Jonah chapter 1 and in verse 1. And it says this: the Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai, get up and go to the great city of Nineveh, announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are. But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. It says he bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing there. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. "How can you sleep at a time like this?" he shouted. "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives." Then the crew cast lots, and the lots identified to identify Jonah as the culprit. Why has this awful storm come down on us? They demanded. Who are you? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality? And Jonah answered and said this. He said, I am a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the land. And what's interesting about this passage is because in the middle of this chaotic storm where the ship is sinking, they're throwing things overboard, they're in fear for their lives, Jonah is on the run from God, and he's not just running from God, but he's asleep down in the bottom of the ship. He's trying to isolate himself from what's going on. But the most interesting thing about this is when they confront Jonah, Jonah is not ashamed of his faith. Jonah says, I'm a Hebrew and I worship the Lord. And he says, the God of heaven who made the sea and the land. He starts proclaiming God's authority and God's power. And he says, I worship him, the one who's doing all this. He wasn't ashamed of his faith. And what this tells me is that you can be a believer and you can be on the run. When we think of people that are running from the Lord, we automatically label them as people who don't believe in God. They don't share the same faith as us. But Jonah was a man of God. He was a man that was called by God. He was a prophet. And here's the thing, you can tell people about God. You can tell them about everything God has done. You can tell them about how God is a God of miracles. You can tell them about how you believe in God and you have faith in Jesus. You could do all of those things, but be walking in disobedience at the same time. Jonah's declaring his faith while he's in the middle of his act of disobedience. You see, he wasn't ashamed of who he was or who he served, but Jonah had rejected his assignment. And I want to talk to you tonight just for a little bit about what exactly Jonah was running from. The first thing that Jonah was running from was a place. There are some places that people just don't want to go. And Nineveh was on the top list for Jonah of places that he did not want to go. Nineveh wasn't just any city that God was calling him to. Nineveh was it was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Today, if you were to go to Nineveh, it would be located where modern day Iraq is. And Nineveh was a place that was wicked, and it was cruel, and it was full of idolatry. Now, just how wicked and how scary was Nineveh? Well, let me give you an example. As archaeologists begin to uncover Nineveh and begin to study its history, they discovered several frightening things about the city itself. They discovered that the people of Nineveh would do things like decapitate their enemies and then stack their heads at their gates to let people know who's in charge, to let people fear them. They would do things like skin people alive and hang them on display for people to see. They would then decorate their city walls with the skin that they had taken off of the people. I know this is real gross stuff, but you've got to understand that the place that God was calling Jonah to go to was a scary place. I mean, it's like something we can't even really comprehend today. But for some of us, what if God called you to go host a tent revival at Lafayette Square Mall? What if God told you to go over on the east side and go door to door telling people about Jesus? But here's the thing you've got to really think about, because the message that God had given Jonah wasn't a message exactly of hope. He didn't tell Jonah, go tell the people that, that I am a gracious God, that I am a loving God, that I want to bless them, that I want to redeem them. No, he told Jonah, go to Nineveh, and I want you to declare my judgment over them. Tell them the judgment is coming, and because of their wickedness and their cruelty, I'm going to destroy them. Can you imagine? So how would you respond if God sent you to a place full of wickedness with an assignment like that? You see, most people would run away. Most people, they take off at the first sign of trouble. And they show up to a church and the usher tells them to sit where they don't want to sit. They're gone. They don't come back. They knock on one door and the person doesn't want to talk about Jesus, so they call it quits and they give up the ministry. You see, Jonah ran before he ever even got to Nineveh because he already knew that it was a bad place. But you see, Jonah's response was wrong. And here's why it's wrong, because as a believer, anytime God calls us anywhere to do anything, our first response should always be what is found in Isaiah 6 and 8. Where it says, "Then I heard the Lord asking, whom should I send as a messenger to these people? Who will go for us? I said, here I am, send me." You see, that should be our response to every assignment and call that God gives us. If God calls you to go to Nineveh, or if there is a need there, and God says, who will go to Nineveh? We've got to be bold and brave enough to say, God, here I am, send me. If God asks who's going to go to Hawville, we've got to be bold enough and brave enough to say, here I am, send me. If God says who's going to go into the streets of Indianapolis, we've got to say, here I am, send me. If God says who's going to go to Amazon in the warehouse and minister to the people there, we've got to be brave enough to say, here I am, send me. And I believe that in 2023, the year that we've just stepped into, that God is calling us in the church as a body, not to be a monument, but to be on the move. Where instead of just going to a place, we show up with the assignment. And where we're being intentional about reaching people for Christ, and we're no longer afraid to say what God wants us to say. So what enables us to be able to go to any place regardless of the circumstances? It's because of the word of the Lord and promises like Isaiah 41:10 that says, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and I will help you, and I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. You see, when you have faith to believe, not just that God created the seas and the lands, but when you have faith to believe that God is with you, that God's going to strengthen you, that God's going to help you, that God is going to hold you up with his victorious hand, when you have faith to believe that, then it doesn't matter if it's Nineveh, it doesn't matter if it's your job, it doesn't matter if it's your home, because you know that God is with you. And when you know he goes with you, you know that victory comes along with him because he's never lost a battle. You see, it's sad that there are so many Christian believers, and yet we have such a little impact on our communities, and in our workplace, and in the school system, and in the government. There are believers everywhere. And it's because we show up to a place without a purpose. So you've got to ask yourself this question first. Are you willing to go to the place that God has called you to go? When I knew that God was calling me to come to Indiana, I had never been to Indiana. I knew nothing about Indiana. It's not when you like research, vacation destinations and places to go, things to see. There's hardly anything in Indiana, right? I was talking to a close friend of mine. He said it's cornfields, there's pigs, there's NASCAR fans. But when God calls you to go somewhere, you just go no matter what it looks like. I remember being a young man hearing stories from my grandpa who got called to pastor a church in Kingman, Arizona. He hadn't even seen the church. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he knew the Lord was calling him to go there. And when he got there, his church had 2 people in it, And it was so run down, he said you could see daylight through the walls. I mean, it was falling apart, but God had called him to a place. And the thing that you've got to be able to do is you've got to be willing to go. So Jonah was running from a place, but he was also running from his purpose. You see, because Jonah was a prophet. He had a calling upon his life. He's somebody that God had given an assignment. He's somebody that God, think about this, God had specifically made Jonah and put gifting and purpose inside of him and had placed him at that point in time because one day God would need a messenger to go to Nineveh and to declare his word to the people. So God took Jonah, he formed him, he put things inside of him, he placed him there in that point in time, and he told him to go. You see, Jonah wasn't there by accident. God had strategically made him for a purpose. He was the messenger of God, and he was given a responsibility. And here's what I know about the gifts and the callings of God. It's in Romans 11:29, and it says, for God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. What does that mean? That means that God, when he created you, when he knew you before anybody else ever did, he took giftings and he took callings and he put them inside of you. And it says they can never be withdrawn. So that means it doesn't matter where you get on a ship and go to. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you make mistakes. It doesn't matter how far you run away. You will never be able to outrun what God has put inside of you. And when you're not operating inside of the purpose that God created you for, you will never find fulfillment in your life. People who live outside of God's will are some of the most miserable people on the earth. They could have all the money in the world. They could have nice cars. They could have a big house. They could have everything, and yet they're miserable. Why? Because God had given them something special. He had put something inside of them, and when you run from what God has for you, you'll always feel empty inside. In 1 Thessalonians 5:24, it says, faithful is he who calls you, and he will also bring it to pass. And here's what I love about God is that God doesn't just send you somewhere. God doesn't just give you an assignment, but God gives you a promise, and he says, I've given you all the giftings that you need. I've called you, I've anointed you, I put purpose inside of you. And if you're willing to be obedient and just go where God has called you to do, God is faithful to bring it to pass. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to worry about how they're going to respond when you do what you've been called to do. You don't have to worry about what it's going to make them feel like. All you have to do is just sit back and trust in God to do what he said he's going to do. If you just do what he told you to do, God will take care of the rest. But where we mess up is we try to make things happen for ourselves. We try to do our own thing. Well, I'm gifted. Well, I'm called. And people go out and do their own thing, and yet they still haven't done the last thing that God told them to do. And until they go back and they do the last thing that God told them to do, they will never be happy and they will never feel fulfilled. They will not live under the blessings of God. When I had finished my junior year in high school, and that summer at youth camp, I got called into ministry. I can't tell you what the message was that was preached. I actually, at that age in my life, I was like, me and my friends, we wreaked havoc in the campgrounds. We had fun, we snuck out at night, we did all kinds of stuff. I mean, we messed around, but I remember sitting in the back with my buddies and we were joking around. People are in the altar praying, right? And we're just sitting back. And I felt the Lord's presence. And I didn't hear God say anything, but I felt like I had to go up to the front and pray. I don't remember the message because I didn't pay attention to what he was even saying. But God's presence got so thick and this pull on my heart got so strong that I couldn't stay in my seat. And I got up and my friends were like, where are you going? And I'm like, I've got to go up there. And I remember I went up there and I started praying and something just broke inside of me. And that night I felt God call me into the ministry. And a lot of the people and the pastors throughout the state that had youth groups there, they knew me, they knew my family, they had seen me grow up. All these different things happened. But when I got called into ministry and I knew that God was going to use me in the ministry, I didn't go around calling everybody, asking if I could preach at their churches. I remember I graduated high school and there were these different little churches around the state, and they wanted me to go be their youth pastor because I was out of school and I had a call of ministry on my life, and I didn't accept any of them. I wasn't applying to be a youth pastor anywhere. I just kept going to the church that I was at until God would reveal to me where I should go. You know, I didn't accept every opportunity that was thrown at me. And today the problem is that people think they're gifted or they think that they're called, and they go around trying to make things happen for themselves, trying to open doors. And the thing is that God's not opening those doors. So when you step through that door, you're not going to find fulfillment, you're not going to find blessing, and you're not going to be in the purpose of God. So you've got to ask yourself this: are you willing to do what God created you to do? And can you be obedient to do it even if it doesn't make you popular? You see, Jonah was faced with a difficult decision, and in that moment, it's like fight or flight kicks in. And for Jonah, he ran. But as believers, we don't have the luxury of running away from the assignment that God has for us. In moments like that, when God calls you to go somewhere or when God calls you to do something, in moments like that, you better be able to fight the good fight of faith. You better be able to stand your ground and put your faith in God. You don't have to have all the answers, but you don't have to run away either. You put your faith in the Word of God. So think about this: being in the right place but not fulfilling your purpose is disobedience. Being in the right place but not fulfilling your purpose is disobedience. Well, what do I mean? I mean that if God has a calling upon your life, and if He has called you to do something in His kingdom, and it could be anything. God might have you at your job for a reason. God might have you living in your neighborhood for a reason. God might have you here in Indianapolis for a reason. God might have led you and your family to Bethel Family Worship Center for a reason. And here's the thing: if you just come to the place that God has led you to, but you don't operate in your gifts or your callings, it's disobedience. If you just show up to a church, but you do nothing, that's disobedience. If you go to the job that God gave you, that God opened up a door for you, that God answered a prayer for you to be at, if you go to that job, but you do nothing, it's disobedience. And I'm not trying to beat anybody up tonight. I'm thankful for each and every person that shows up to the house of God. But what I'm trying to tell you is that if Jonah would have just gone to Nineveh and said nothing, it would have been disobedient. And not only would it have been disobedient on his part, but it would have been ineffective for all the people in Nineveh that needed to hear the word of the Lord. So how many of us go to our homes, our jobs, throughout our community, but we forget that we're there for a reason and that God has a purpose for us? Because just like Jonah, God created you for a reason. God placed things inside of you that nobody could take away from you. God took you and put you at this point in time in 2023, not just to be comfortable, not just to go through a routine, but so that you can make a difference in the world around you. Here's what I also know, that operating in the gifts outside of the place you've been called is disobedience. You see, if Jonah would have said, God, I don't want to go to Nineveh because I don't like it. The people are mean, they're nasty, it smells because there's dead people all up in there. So if he decided to go to Jerusalem instead, and he gets there and he arrives and he announces himself saying, I'm a prophet of the Lord, and he begins speaking to the people, prophesying, that would be disobedient and it would be out of order. Why? Because God had never called him to go to Jerusalem. God told him to go to Nineveh. And here's the thing, just because you go to a new church, because you didn't get the opportunities that you thought you deserved at the last one, thinking that you're gonna go someplace new to get an opportunity to sing, to play, to preach, it's disobedient and it's out of order. Especially when you showed up at the last place saying, God brought me here. God led me to this church. God spoke to my family that this is the place to get planted and plugged in. You see, operating in your giftings but not being where God has called you is out of order. And when you start serving the place and the purpose that God has for you, here's what happens: it brings results. When you find yourself in alignment with what God has for your life, and you're at the church that you're supposed to be at, you're at the job that you're supposed to be at, you're in the relationship that you're supposed to be in, when you're in the right place and you're doing what God has called you to do, it brings results. Fruit will become evident in your life. And the reason why there are so many ministries out there that are fruitless is because people are trying to make things happen for themselves rather than letting them be birthed out of obedience to God. Jonah didn't have to do anything else except go where God had called him to do and say what God had called him to say. And here's what you've got to realize is that running with people that are running from God will destroy you. It will destroy you. As we continue in the passage of Jonah, I'm going to summarize. It says this, that Jonah told them who he was. He said, I'm a Hebrew. I serve the Lord, the God who created the sea and the land. He told them that he was running from the Lord, and the people are upset with him. They're like, why? Why are you running from God? And they say, what should we do to stop this? And Jonah tells them, well, the only thing I could think of is you've got to throw me overboard. You've got to throw me overboard. That's the only way you're going to make it out of this. And it says the people, instead of just throwing Jonah overboard, it says they begin to work harder, trying to keep their ship afloat. They start rowing harder and harder. They begin feeling exhausted. They begin crying out, and they say, oh Lord, don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. And then they said, oh Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons. Isn't it interesting how God used Jonah's disobedience to capture the attention of everybody else on this ship? But here's what you learn, that when you get yoked up with disobedience, it will cost you everything that you have. At first, the people had to throw some luggage overboard because the person they were connected to was costing them. But then they realized that just losing a few things still wasn't enough to keep them afloat, because they kept sinking. And it says, then they begin to row and they begin to get exhausted. So now it's cost them their possessions. Now they're physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted and drained, having to put up with this mess all the time and yet not breaking the connection between the two. And here's the thing, when you become yoked up with disorder, it will disrupt your journey. You see, they had already had a plan to go somewhere before Jonah ever got on their ship. But having Jonah connected to them, having Jonah yoked up with them, traveling with them was about to cost them their entire journey because they weren't willing to let go of him. And when you get yoked up in the wrong relationship, when you surround yourself with the wrong friends, it'll start costing you things. It'll start draining you. You'll feel like you're sinking and going down with them. And you will, unless you're willing to break it off. You see, the people, they were torn because they didn't want to sink, but they also didn't want to be responsible for throwing Jonah overboard. And here's a situation where being too nice can cost you. And a lot of you, you're loving, you're nice. There are people that you care about. There are people that you have history with. There are people that you don't want to hurt. But the honest truth is that if you're not willing to let go, it's going to cost you everything. You will never reach the destination that God has for you if you're not willing to let go. And loyalty to God should never take a back seat to loyalty with people. It doesn't matter who they are or what you've been through together. You should never choose to be loyal to somebody else rather than loyal to God. I don't care how long you've been in a relationship. I don't care what they've said to you, what they've given you. Your obedience to Christ should never be compromised by your relationship with another person. But here's the good news about the whole story with Jonah. It's that God gave Jonah a second chance. God didn't give up on Jonah because of what Jonah had done. And in Jonah chapter 3, we read about where Jonah, you know, after he got thrown overboard, he got swallowed by the fish. Then he was inside of the fish and he had this big long prayer meeting with God. And then he got spit up and he just happened to be in Nineveh. You see, God has a funny way of getting us back on track. Sometimes it doesn't look like the way we thought it would. Sometimes God getting you back on track is you losing a job. Sometimes it's you having to move. God has a weird way of getting you back on course. But he gave Jonah a second chance, and he told Jonah for a second time, I want you to get up. I want you to go to Nineveh and deliver the message that I've given you. And it says this time, Jonah responded differently, and he went to Nineveh, and this is the message that he said to the people in Nineveh. He said, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. I mean, that's real deep. All this happened to say one sentence. And it says, when Jonah delivered this message to the people of Nineveh, it says that everybody believed it. Jonah that ran from this assignment shows up, he speaks one sentence, what God had given him to say. He finally was obedient to his assignment, and everybody believed what he said. And it says the king, from the king down, it says they covered themselves with burlap and they began mourning and praying and crying out to God. It says the king even commanded that the animals put on burlap and mourn and pray. Can you imagine the king telling everybody, I want you to get your cats, your dogs, and we're going to have a prayer meeting because the city is about to be destroyed. God didn't give up on Jonah because he made a mistake. God didn't give up on Jonah because his life was headed in the wrong direction. When Jonah got spit up by the whale, God didn't meet him there and say, Jonah, I'm disappointed in you. Jonah, I can't believe that you would try to run away. You see, God didn't shame Jonah. God didn't throw guilt on Jonah, but God gave Jonah a second chance. And he said, Jonah, this is what I want you to do. He didn't throw all the mistakes in his face. He didn't bring up everything that he had done. But he was helping Jonah get back on track. He was making the crooked path straight and giving him an opportunity to make things right. And when Jonah spoke the word of the Lord, it said that the people in Nineveh, it said they stopped doing evil. They stopped being violent. And it says that God even changed his mind and decided to spare the entire kingdom. You see, the people of Nineveh had been given a death sentence. In 40 days, you're all gone. In 40 days, this entire kingdom will be no more. But because of one man's obedience, and because God refused to give up on him and God gave him a second chance, an entire kingdom was saved. So here's what I want you to grab a hold of tonight. Don't tell me that God's purpose for your life isn't that important. Don't tell me that God can't use you at your job. Don't tell me that God doesn't want to use you in your city. Don't tell me that God can't use you in your home. Don't tell me that you're too old. Don't tell me that you've made too many mistakes. And because here's what I know is that all it takes is for one little act of obedience and you could experience revival in your life. All it takes is you stepping out in faith and people at your job could start getting saved. All it takes is you being brave and bold and asking your neighbor if they want to go to church. That's all it takes to get an entire home saved. If you're willing to go where God leads you and do what he has called you to do. You might feel unqualified. You might think that it's pointless to go to that place. That place is too far gone. The people are too messed up. God can never save those people. It doesn't matter what you feel or how you've looked at it. You will be surprised at what will happen when you take your eyes off yourself and the circumstances and you put them on God. We had an entire year talking about focus, how Jesus set his eyes to Jerusalem. Jesus his eyes weren't on the circumstances. His eyes weren't on all the things that he would have to go through. He knew his purpose, he knew his assignment, and he went and did it. So Jonah was running from a place, he was running from a purpose, and Jonah was running from God's decision. And here's what I never realized about Jonah, because growing up, when I heard this story about Jonah, I always thought that Jonah ran because he was afraid. I always thought that Jonah ran because of how wicked and how cruel Nineveh was. I thought that Jonah didn't want to go there because he heard about the decapitated people. I thought Jonah didn't want to go there because he knew that those weren't God's people. I thought Jonah didn't want to go there because of how scary it was. But when you read Jonah chapter 4, you find out that the reason why Jonah didn't want to go there was entirely different. It says this change of plans greatly upset Jonah and he became very angry. Talking about when God changed his mind and decided to spare Nineveh. Says, so he complained to the Lord about it. Didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? That is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. Just kill me now, Lord. I'd rather be dead than alive if what I predicted will not happen. And the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry about this? You see, Jonah ran away from his assignment, not because he was afraid, not because he was intimidated, not because of the word that God had given him to share, but Jonah ran away because he knew God and because he didn't agree with him. Jonah ran away because he knew that God would be compassionate. He knew that if they repented, that God would show mercy. And he ran away because Jonah had a stronger desire to see those people condemned than for them to be saved. Jonah thought that they didn't deserve forgiveness. Jonah thought that those people in Nineveh, that they weren't worthy of God's mercy. They weren't worthy of God's love. They weren't worthy of God giving them a second chance. So when Jonah found out that God had changed his mind, he got angry and began to shout at God and even said, God, just kill me. Just kill me. And you've got to ask yourself this question: what do you do when you don't agree with God's decision? Jonah ran because he knew God enough to know that God is loving and compassionate and would forgive them if they cried out to him. And when God forgave them, Jonah threw the biggest temper tantrum ever. And I've seen this so many times in people in my life. When God tells somebody that they shouldn't be in a relationship, they don't agree with the decision, so they run from God. All right, God, then I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to serve here. When things don't go the way that they thought they should have, when things don't go the way that they wanted them to go, Jonah got mad and he ran. So although Jonah is angry that God forgave these people and showed compassion on them, Jonah was never upset about God giving him a second chance. Jonah never complained that well spit him up on the shores of Nineveh. When Jonah got out of the mouth of the fish, Jonah wasn't looking for another ship. He wasn't trying to run away again. He wasn't complaining. Jonah simply listened to God, accepted the second chance, and went and did what God had called him to do. But isn't it interesting how we can have so little compassion for the people in our lives, and yet expect endless love and mercy from God for ourselves? Think about the people in our lives that have wronged us, that have hurt us, that have lied about us, that have talked about us. And we look at them and we don't pray for them. We don't speak to them anymore. We don't reach out to them. We don't love on them. We're not kind to them. We isolate ourselves from them. But when we mess up and we make mistakes, we expect everybody to run to us. And when I read this story, it really grabbed a hold of my heart because sometimes we could be so distracted by ministry and by assignments that we forget that everything we do is to reach people. Every service we have in this building, it's not for us. It's not so that we could feel good about ourselves. It's not so that we could just feel the love of God and experience his mercy and grace. Every service we have, every event that we have, every message we send out, every Facebook post, every email, everything we do is to try to get people to God. It's to try to get a message of hope and love to the people like the citizens of Nineveh who might be living in a wicked and cruel environment, the people who are far from God, the people who don't know about his love and mercy. Everything we do is for the people. It's not so that we could sing a song or so that we could preach or that so we could serve in children's ministry. Everything we do is about people. When you go to your job, it's not just about a paycheck, but God has you at your job, at your workplace for the people. So I'm not just working for money, but I'm doing my job and I'm also being a light in a world that's full of darkness. I'm working in the middle of Nineveh, doing my job, but I'm also sharing God's love and mercy and grace. I'm telling people about all the good things that God has done in my life, all the prayers that He's answered, and I'm telling them it's not just for me, but it's for you too. We can never lose our love and our compassion for people. Many of you know this name because this man was infamous. But Saddam Hussein, how many of you guys have ever heard of him? He was a cruel, cruel man. He murdered innocent people. He committed all these crimes against humanity. And because of everything that he'd done, I remember being young and watching the news and seeing all the stories about him. And they had sentenced him to a public execution where they hung him. And I remember them televising this whole event of them hanging Saddam Hussein. And I remember being in the living room with my grandfather, and we're watching the news and we're watching what's going on and we're watching all this unfold, and the people in those communities, they were rejoicing. They were so happy that justice was finally being served, and publicly they hung him for everybody to see, and they broadcasted it across all the televisions in our nation. And I remember in the moment that happened, my grandfather, who was sitting in the room, he had a tear drip down his face. And I was so confused by that. And I said, "Grandpa, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" And he looked at me and he said, "I'm crying because that's a soul that's been lost." You see, when he looked at that man, even though that man had been cruel and wicked and had committed all these crimes, he looked past all the mistakes. He looked past all those things and he saw a soul. He saw somebody that had been created by God. He saw somebody that had giftings and had purpose that would never be fulfilled because they ran from God. He saw somebody that would be lost. And maybe he was lost because God had given somebody else an assignment to go somewhere to say something. And they never did it because it looked too scary. They never did it because of the circumstances. Have you ever played the game of tag? And I'm gonna start to close. Have you ever played the game of tag? Some of you guys, it might have been a while. So here's what we're gonna do. Everybody stand to your feet. I'm kidding. Kids love playing tag. And playing tag is fun because you don't have to have anything but people. And if you're watching a big group of kids, you know, it's one of the best things you could do with the kids because you can make them run until they're out of energy. But the funny thing about tag is that somebody else is it, and you're doing everything you can to run away from the person who's it. You're running as fast as you can to get away from them. And if you stop running, and if you get tired, then that person can then get a hold of you. And when they get a hold of you, it changes the whole game, because now, instead of running away from them, you're now running after them because now you are it. And here's the thing about God is that as a sinner, somebody who doesn't know God, it's like we live our lives running away from Him. We're running after all these different things, our own desires, temptations, dreams, goals, whatever is set before us. We're running after all these different things, but there's something significant that happens in our life, because there's a moment that happens with God where he gets a hold of you and where things begin to change. There's a moment where you experience God's presence and his love and his mercy and his goodness, and your life then changes directions. So now, instead of running away from something, you're now running towards something, because you discover, I'm not here by accident. I have a purpose for my life. God has gifted me. God has called me. God has an assignment for my life. So now you're running after something. Why? Because you are it. Look, point at your neighbor and say, you are it. So think about this. Your job may be an absolute nightmare. I remember working construction before I came here, and a lot of the people I worked with, contractors, all these different people, it wasn't a great environment. People used foul language all the time. They told dirty jokes. People were mean. They were rude. But no matter what your work environment looks like, if you're there, that means that you are it. In your home, your kids may not accept Jesus right now. Your spouse may not even be living for Jesus. But when you're in your home, you are it. When you're in Indianapolis or you're driving down the street, it doesn't matter what you see going on around you. It doesn't matter what's been on the news. You are it. This is the place that God has you. Now, what can he do through you? What will happen when you stop running? What will happen when you let God get a hold of you and then you start running after his purpose and his plan for your life? Think about these people from the Bible. When Elijah stopped running from Jezebel, it created a legacy that outlived him and outperformed him. Jezebel didn't have the final say. All Elijah had to do was stop running and let God get a hold of him. When the woman at the well stopped running, she stopped being thirsty. She had gone from relationship to relationship, and yet she was never fulfilled. She wasn't just running from relationship to relationship, trying to fill the void in her life, but she was also running from the reputation that she had given herself from being in all these relationships. She was running from the people that would be at the well at a certain time of day and make fun of her and talk about her, so she wouldn't go there. She would stay away from them. But her destiny wasn't going to be determined by her past. It wasn't going to be determined by all of the failed relationships in her life. It wasn't going to be decided by the people who knew her. Why? Because God is the author and the finisher. And when God got a hold of that woman, she stopped being thirsty. She left her water jug at the well because she found something that she couldn't get anywhere else. All she had to do was stop running. When the woman with the issue of blood stopped running, she found healing. What do I mean? She had ran from doctor to doctor to doctor. She had exhausted all of her resources trying to find somebody that could help her, somebody that could cure her of the disease that she had. But when she stopped running to people and she got a hold of Jesus, she found healing. When Peter stopped running, he experienced reconciliation and revival. Peter had denied Jesus. He had gone back to fishing. But when he stopped running from being who God had called him to be, when he stopped running from his assignment, and he was able to get a hold of Jesus again, he found forgiveness and they were reconciled. And then Peter was obedient to Christ and started to run after him. And then revival broke loose. And Peter all of a sudden had a boldness and was a brave follower of God who was fearless in the eyes of the people. When Martha stopped running, she discovered intimacy with Jesus. You see, Martha was all upset because she was hosting people in her home, and she was worried about every little detail. How are we going to work this out? How are we going to take care of all these people? She was running around, making sure people were taken care of, making sure every need was met, worried and concerned about all these little things. And then she got upset because Mary wasn't doing anything except sitting there by Jesus. And Martha went to Jesus, and she'd been running around and running around and running around, distracted, trying to take care of all these things, worried all the time. And she's complaining about her sister Mary. And Jesus told Martha, Martha, Mary found something far better, and it's not going to be taken away from her. You see, she had to stop running to discover intimacy with Jesus. As you stand to your feet tonight, while heads are bowed and eyes are closed for just a moment, we're in a new year. Some of you made New Year's resolutions. Some of you have declared that you're stepping into a new season. You want to see change happen in your life. You want to see the blessings of God. You have prayers that you are believing will be answered by God. And to all those things, I would say this. Matthew 6:33, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything that you need. Sometimes what we've got to do is we've got to stop running from our assignments, and we've just got to seek God and get a hold of him. And God will take care of everything else. So this year, for every family that's a part of this body watching online, we're believing this year will be the year where you find your place. That this year will be the year where you find your purpose. That this year will be the year where you're obeying the word of the Lord and going where he has called you and doing what he has told you to do. That this will be the year where you experience the awe and the wonder of God. You see, people thought that Nineveh probably would have never changed their ways. They thought that the people were too cruel and that they were too far gone. But all it took to reach Nineveh was a man of God to get back on the right path again. All it took was one act of obedience. And you and your family, you're only one act of obedience away from the start of a revival in your life. It doesn't matter where God has called you to go. Just go. It doesn't matter what God has called you to do. Just do it. It doesn't matter what he has told you to say. Just say it. And God is faithful to bring everything else to pass. God is faithful to meet every need. God is faithful to open up the right doors. God is faithful to provide, to deliver. And he says, do not be afraid, for he is with you. He is with you. 2023 is the year that you no longer feel alone, but you declare over your life, he is with me. He is with me. I want to invite our prayer team to come this evening. And maybe you're here tonight and you've been running from God. It doesn't matter how far away from Him you've gotten. It doesn't matter how bad you've messed up. Tonight, God has given you a second chance. God has given you an opportunity to come back to Him, to experience His love in your life, to find fulfillment, to discover the purpose that He has for you. And all you have to do is make one decision, and that's giving your life to Jesus. All you have to do is let God get a hold of you in one moment, and then watch how you leave that moment running towards God instead of away from Him. Or maybe you're in here tonight and you know that God has an assignment for your life. And you know that God has called you to do something, but you've been afraid. Maybe He's been trying to lead you to serve in an area of the church, but you've been hesitant and you've held back. Maybe you've even felt unqualified. Maybe you've even felt like God will just use somebody else instead. I'm telling you, you're not here by accident. And God wants to use you just as much as the person next to you. That's you tonight. We want to pray with you as well and believe that this year you'll find your purpose and God will use you. Would you come tonight?